So you can see by the title, it's called a multiple levels of analysis presentation on maltreatment. And that means my work studies not just behavior, but it studies brain, it studies genetics, and it also provides intervention. And I obviously can't give you all the work I've done, even though I probably have tried to give too much anyway. And there's some I'm only going to be presenting a major intervention, but I've done several others. And again, there's the time issue, but if we can talk about those things later, that's wonderful. Okay, so if you look at child maltreatment, it's a pathogenic relational experience that represents one of the most adverse and stressful challenges that confront children and families. It ushers in motion a probabilistic path of development for abused and neglected children that's marked by an increased likelihood in the children of failing the major developmental tasks of the early years, and they cascade oftentimes into failure into the later years. So it's a major problem. When people think of maltreatment, they often think of the acts of maltreatment, but the consequences of those acts on biological development, physical development, and psychological development are major. And often increase the risk for later mental problems as well. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how many children are maltreated. And there have been 4 national incidence studies that have taken place. The first one was brought about by the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which Walter Mondale instituted, I think, in 1974. And there have been 4 such incidence studies. And in these incidence studies, the most recent one was published in 2010. And there are about 1.3 million children who meet the harm standard. That means they've already identified that these kids have experienced, harm, as they define harm, and there's another 3 million children who have who meet the endangerment standard. That means they're thought to be at high risk. Now again, these aren't through research, these are through reading case records and stuff like that, but it gives you the clear image that these children are, there are many of them, over 4 million, and I would bet anything that that's the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. Also, the estimated annual costs are about $124 billion a year, and there are also long-term health costs, special ed costs, child welfare costs, losses in productivity, and the like that go on throughout life. So, this is a book that was published in 1979 by Elizabeth Elmer, a social worker who was, in addition to Henry Kemp, one of the 2 most powerful figures in the field of child abuse at that time. And she published a paper in which she followed up 8 years later a group of physically abused children and children who were accident victims and looked at their developmental outcomes. Do not be critical here, please don't take this as arrogance. She did not have very good measures. She didn't have a real developmental perspective. She never checked if the accident victims were indeed maltreated between age 1 when she called them accident and age 9 when she saw them the second time. And there are many other flaws that I've published about this study. The reason it's important is she concluded that abuse per se did not have any harmful effects on development that were independent of the risk factors that were associated with membership in the low SES. In other words, being poor, SES, socioeconomic status. She was basically saying child maltreatment's effects are no worse than simply being poor. Now that exerted a major impact on the field of child abuse research because a number of longitudinal studies were funded. Remember I told you about Mondale's Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. A lot of 3, 4, 5, 6 big studies were funded, and my study at that time, I was a professor at Harvard, mine was one of them. Byron Eglin, one of my mentors in graduate school, his was another one. All of these studies were affected because to people who were funding, Longitudinal research was an anathema. It didn't matter because they believed that over time there's no difference between abuse and poverty in essence. And we all know how our nation has dealt with poverty over the years. So, they could easily sweep this under the rug. People embarked on other studies, and that's kind of what led into what I'm going to be talking about, just focusing on my work. We developed a classification system called the maltreatment classification system. And I want to underscore, Mount Hope has a very close relationship with the Department of Human Services in Rochester, Monroe County. We have a trusting relationship with them. It's reciprocal. They know that we are helping families and children and will help them, and vice versa. So one of the things we have is their trust in going through case records with parental permission and coming up with things like, well, what subtype or subtypes of maltreatment did a given child experience? Emotional maltreatment, physical neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse. How many subtypes does a given child have? You'll notice in the literature that often people say, she's neglected, he's abused, when in reality, there's a comorbidity of subtype in a very high percentage. Most maltreated children experience more than one subtype. How severe is each of the types? That's another thing that we look at. Who was the perpetrator or perpetrators? How many developmental periods did the child experience maltreatment? Was it only, let's say, in infancy, or maybe never until they were in grade school or adolescence? Or was it very chronic? And what impact does that have differentially on how maltreatment affects the child's development? Now, how do we do, so this is a coding system we have developed that's reliable, that's used across the country in over 50 laboratories. And why that's important is if people are studying child maltreatment and using this system, we can know that we're all talking about the same thing, and that's critical. So, recruitment, how do we recruit samples? Well, our maltreated kids are random and representative and voluntary. So, no one in the Department of Human Services says, Mrs. So-and-so, you must be in this research or it's going to have a negative impact on the services you receive. Absolutely nothing. Completely voluntary. But because we have the relationship, we can get maltreatment information from the Department of Human Services, then code the records with a maltreatment classification system, and then we give what's called the maternal child maltreatment interview, where we actually interview maltreating mothers and comparison or non-maltreating mothers. And again, to just take the record of what the Department of Human Services might call it, and this is not meant to be pejorative in any way, coding it objectively from the record, you get additional information that might not be there in just the simple report of, well, we think he's abused. Then the non-maltreated. We get them from temporary assistance for needy families. It's because we're matching on socioeconomic variables. Most maltreated kids in departments of human services are poor. We also give them the maternal child maltreatment interview, the non-maltreating mothers, to make sure that they haven't experienced maltreatment. And we also verify the absence of indicated maltreatment in the child abuse registry in New York. So those are the ways we get the sample. Now, what are some selected consequences of child maltreatment? How does maltreatment affect kids? One way is it affects the caregiver-child attachment relationship. This is major. Attachment is thought to be the most important developmental issue in the first year of life. And most children, by around, say, 6 to 12 months, will develop an attachment relationship with their primary caregiver. The issue is, what is the quality of that relationship? So in other words, even if you're abused severely and haven't been, gotten into foster care and taken away from your family, if you're in that family and you're seen, your attachment is going to be formed with that mother, even if it's an abusive mother. And I'm saying mother, not because I'm a sexist, but because, as we all know, the vast majority of these families, there's not a father to be found. There's very few fathers. If you look in the literature, there's almost nothing known about maltreating fathers or father figures. That's a big future issue that must be looked into. John Bowlby talked about how when you form an attachment, you form what he called an internal working model of your attachment figure and of yourself. And so maltreated kids form clearly a negative working model of their caregiver and of themselves in relation to others that is carried forward in development without any kind of intervention. And there's a particular type of attachment that is found in maltreated kids, and it's called the disorganized attachment. So what is a disorganized attachment? And I'll say more when I talk about an intervention later. But a disorganized attachment is an attachment where a kid shows contradictory behaviors toward its caregiver in an experimental situation that is shown to be effective to code quality of attachment. And so if a mother comes back into a room after a brief separation, if you're a disorganized kid, you might approach her completely looking away. You might spin around in circles. You might just daze like this, etc. And in fact, some longitudinal work has shown that disorganized, disoriented, gazing type symptom can longitudinally be associated with the development of later dissociative personality disorder in adulthood. Not in everyone gets it, but a higher probability of that happening. It's a sequelae. Okay, so there are emotion recognition anomalies in these kids. So physically abused kids identify anger really quickly in a sequence. Even if you morph the sequence and you have it looking more and more and more and more and more like angry faces, they can spot it way earlier in the sequence than other types of maltreated kids or non-maltreated kids. On the other hand, and this is, I'm always talking about my work here, okay, or my work with my students. If you're neglected, there's difficulty differentiating among emotions. So neglected kids who probably have a real paucity of emotional experience in their environments have trouble differentiating sad from happy, from neutral, from angry, etc. Now, there are some psychophysiological correlates, which I'll show you in a bit, where we have found that if we have them hooked up to some electrodes and they're looking at stimuli randomly, angry, happy, or neutral, that abused kids are much more likely to have an increased amplitude in their event-related potential in the brain to angry stimuli. And also that they process anger differently than non-maltreated kids. So if you look at this first one, you'll see that for happy and neutral facial expressions, there's a very similar topographical distribution of this P260 event-related potential, ERP. P just means positive, and 260 means the number of milliseconds that went by since the introduction of the angry stimulus or happy stimulus or neutral stimulus that got a response in them. For angry facial expressions, it attains maximum amplitude at the frontal sites. See that? Up in the angry, that's the frontal lobe in the maltreated kids. For non-maltreated kids, the maximum amplitude, as you can see here, is in more central sites of the brain. So they are processing angry stimuli differently. And here's just another example with another P240, where you can see a greater response to happy in the non-maltreated, and in the maltreated, continued increase in anger. Okay, so I hope I can get this back. Yes. Now, and also Emotion dysregulation is a major consequence of child maltreatment. And you know, one of the interesting things, again, remember, these are all in terms of probability. It's not like if this happens to you, then you're going to get that negative thing. It's probability. And probability is worse if you were maltreated. So, for example, recently with adults, they've been talking about how some adults with bipolar illness, what used to be called manic depression, about 40% of them have histories of child maltreatment. And there's been some speculation about what might that experience do in interaction with your biology to increase the likelihood down the road that you would get bipolar disorder. Do you see that? It's probability. They have problems with the development of the self. So even starting off as babies, if they look at themselves in a mirror and then you surreptitiously wipe the child's nose with some rouge and have the child look at him or herself in the mirror again, somewhere between 18 to 24 months, children will know that that's not baby in the mirror, it's themselves. And they show this by, as they look at the rouge-altered nose, they touch their own nose. Now, when you look at maltreated kids, they don't show any difference in the cognitive aspect, i.e. knowing that baby in the mirror is me. But where they show differences is in the affect that they display when viewing their rouge-altered self-images. And they show far more negative affect when looking at themselves very early. Could mean a whole lot of things, but can't think of one that's adaptive or positive, but more a consequence of maltreatment. If you look at their self or emotion language early on, say age 2, age 3, maltreated kids talk far less about their internal states than do non-maltreated kids, and especially about negative affect. And again, one can think about why might that be the case. It might be very adaptive if you're an abused kid, let's say, or a maltreated kid with multiple subtypes of maltreatment, to not talk about negative affect in the presence of your caregiver, because that might increase the probability that you're going to get maltreated again. Or go back to attachment. If you approach your caregiver and veer away, that might be adaptive in the sense that eye-to-eye contact in conspecifics might increase the probability of arousal and aggression. But what might be adaptive in one context, let's say the maltreating context, may not be adaptive if that child, say, goes into a school, a preschool or a school, and emits those kind of behaviors, because that's going to evoke some responses from his or her peers. See that? So that this is just some of the self stuff. And they do have problematic peer relations, and there's a lot more relational aggression and physical aggression that these kids experience, but they also are more likely in school to be bullies. They're often bully victims, where they're more likely to bully and more likely to be victimized. And again, one possibility is when you're in a relationship and you internalize both sides of the relationship that you're in, you watch your caregiver both you develop compassion for what happens to a maltreated kid, but also they see the those type of behaviors emitted toward them. So it's like they are internalizing both sides of the relationship, victim and victimizer. So I think that's one explanation for why are they more likely to be bullied, because they've internalized the victim, and why are they more likely to have a relational aggression and physical aggression, because they've internalized the victimizer. Okay? So it's very complex, a lot of this stuff, to see. There are social information processing biases. So for example, if you show have a task where two children are, say, building a block tower independently, and you show a vignette of one of the children hitting the block tower of the other child, and it falls. And you have a good vignette, so it kind of looks ambiguous. Was that intentional or was that an accident? And maltreated children, and in particular physically abused maltreated children, are more likely to impute hostile intentionality to ambiguous situations. And so you can see how that could go over time and even get to where there's a, if you think of something like later development of paranoid personality, where if you're going to be someone who's going to be looking at these things that, oh, they're doing that on purpose to me, it's another way that one could develop paranoia. And we have shown in longitudinal studies that that is one possible outcome. So those will give you some things. They develop a lot of psychopathology, substance abuse, delinquency, major depressive disorders, I said earlier, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and personality disorders, like antisocial personality and even on occasion psychotic disorders. There's some research again showing an increased amount of maltreatment in schizophrenic individuals and their histories. So biological markers. Allostatic load refers to the price that the body pays when it's confronted with repeated major stressors. And when this happens, there are physiological sequelae of this chronic stress that affect the brain and that affect neuroendocrine responsiveness. And I would guess probably that Megan undoubtedly talked to them about the neuroendocrine system when she spoke. But when you have these adaptive systems that are interconnected and they're chronically dysregulated over time, then maladaptive physiological and psychological consequences are likely to ensue that may persist throughout the life course. So things that dysregulation of the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, where you see neuroendocrine functioning, that can happen early on and be problematic in adulthood. And so I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the work that we've done recently. There was a study by Christine Heim, who's a very well-known researcher who is now in Germany, and she did research with adult women who had major depressive disorder. And she found that among those adults with those women with major depressive disorder, those who had been maltreated before they were 12 years of age were more likely to have high depression and high internalizing symptoms, and to also have dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the so-called stress axis, physiologically. So Megan Gunner and I actually did a study together. We've done several over the years. But I'll talk about one. Does timing of maltreatment and type of maltreatment provide greater specificity to these effects? And so we did a study where we had 265 maltreated kids, 288 non-maltreated kids, mean age around 10. We got cortisol at 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon daily for 5 consecutive days. We got observed ratings of children's depression as well as children's self-report of depression and internalizing, and we looked at maltreated groups who were either abused, i.e. physical and or sexual, pre-age 5, whereas remember Heim used age 12, and not early physical or sexual, and that would be all other maltreated kids, okay? Another thing about Heim's was it was retrospective. She asked them to talk about their maltreatment. So you're 35 years old and you're going to talk about what happened to you, years ago. There may be some inaccuracy there. This is prospective work. One thing you might want to know is how do you get cortisol 5 days in a row at 9 and at 4? Well, for 28 years, I've operated a summer camp at Mount Hope Family Center. And we have a summer camp where for a week we have roughly about 250 children come to camp, and it's both for fun and for research. And one of the reasons we're able to do this, of course, is that the families in Rochester, New York know about Mount Hope Family Center, and they know it's a safe place. We have that relation that took time to get, and that's a critical thing to remember when you're looking at research-practice interface. So we have a camp, and they are bused there, and 9 in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon, and in recent years we also do it at 12:30, 9, 12:30, and 4. So we have, a whole lot of cortisol. So it's not like we're just happening to get cortisol one time on some day at some time. It's the exact same time, same days, the whole thing. And that, again, the camp context is perfect for that sort of work. And then if you look at the characteristics, about 80% of them had physical abuse, about 28% sexual, about a little over 8% had both, 73% had neglect, and you can see when it's exceeding 100, you know that there's comorbidity going on. 73% experienced emotional. There are an average of 2.55 different subtypes that kids experienced, not just a pure subtype. Onset in infancy, the first time they were maltreated in DHS, 43.3%, 25% in toddlerhood, 31.7% between 3 to 5. You can see most all of these kids were pre-age 5. And the recency is 18% were after preschool, so there were some who were that, and the mean of 2.2 developmental periods. And I'm going to see how quickly I can go. Let me just talk kind of quickly so that I get to everything else. Basically, what we found here is the kids who had low internalizing or depressive symptoms were not different in their cortisol from the non-maltreated kids. Or either physically abused, sexually abused weren't different from emotionally maltreated, physically neglected, or from the non-maltreated comparisons. If you look over here, if they had high internalizing, this group, where it's going down like that, shows a flattening of the diurnal regulation of cortisol. Usually cortisol drops over the day. That's what these are pretty much doing here. But you can see this one went more of a flattening. And that suggests that the kids who were physically and sexually abused, and I have other slides I could show, but I want to be sensitive to time, were the ones who were more likely to have a flattening of cortisol, to have a real dysregulation of the HPA axis compared with high internalizing and onset less than age 5, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And then another study we did, we looked at a gene, and that's CRHR1. And again, don't get freaked out by genes, and I'm going to try to just make it simple as possible. That CRHR1 stands for the corticotropin releasing hormone receptor gene. And that's the gene that's associated with the stress axis, with the HPA axis. And we got DNA from kids, and you can get DNA pretty easily through, for example, salivary. There's kits where you just basically expectorate into a kit and you shake it up and you can get DNA, and then it's genotyped in a lab. And of course, none of this is ever done, remember, without parental permission. So there's nothing underhanded, or genetics freaks people out. But when you hear how we use genetics, you'll see. Basically, we found that there's a variant of this particular gene that when maltreated, when a child is also maltreated and has a variant of this gene, they're more likely to have flattened cortisol. And if you look at another gene that we looked at, which is the 5-HTT-LPR, that's the serotonin linked polymorphic region gene. This gene is associated with mood and emotion regulation. the combination of a particular variant of the CRHR1 gene and of the 5-HTT-LPR gene in maltreated kids resulted in increases in internalizing and flattening of cortisol. Now, that's important to know because we start thinking, what are some of the contributions to some of these emotion problems in maltreated kids? They aren't only the psychological aspects of maltreatment, but in the main, in my opinion, maltreatment per se has a much more harmful effect on these kids than does anything genetic, and I think you'll see that as I talk along. But there's that going on there in that study. Now, here's another study which is on suicide ideation. Maltreated kids and adults are more likely to think about suicide, try suicide, and actually succeed at suicide. And so we did a study looking at the serotonin, the 5-HTT-LPR genotype, and they have what's called an LL, an SS, or an SL. They're the three genotypes you can inherit, basically, from that gene. And we found was that if kids had 1 to 2 types of maltreatment, then there'd be higher suicide ideation if they had either the SS or the SL genotype compared to those who had the LL genotype. So if you had any 1 to 2, abuse and neglect, abuse and sex abuse, you put them together, that's what happened. For kids who, here's a real interesting finding. For kids with 3 to 4 maltreatment subtypes, in other words, basically everything that's there is no genetic moderation at all of the findings. These children have high suicidal ideation regardless of genotype. The effects of more extreme exposure to maltreatment clearly outweighed the genetic effects. And I want you to hear this also. We're not looking for the gene that caused something. No one's ever found that gene, and that's not how I think about it. Maltreated kids, these are G by E. It's gene-environment interaction. The environment is maltreatment, the gene's the gene, and you almost always find when there is a main effect of something related to something else, it's maltreatment has a main effect on the outcome. It's not genetics. You do sometimes find the G by E interaction, and that's if you have one of the potential genotypes of a given gene in interaction with maltreatment. It's not that it is the cause, okay? But this is important because it's letting us know there are some kids who are more at risk based on this configuration of maltreatment and genotype, and that might necessitate fast intervention or paying attention to their suicide ideation and not thinking, oh, well, it's just a normal thing, you know what I mean? So there's that. And essentially it's that maltreatment in interaction with a variant of a gene increases the probability sometimes of a negative outcome that also was found just by virtue of being maltreated. So now maltreatment might be associated with depression and higher depression, but if you have maltreatment linked with a variant of the gene, you might find a little more explained, okay? Ask me questions right now. I don't want this to go weird because I'm trying to communicate it isn't about gene. It's about maltreatment, main effect, and gene by environment, with maltreatment being the environment interaction. Do you have any comments, questions, anything like that? The genes I've shown you have been genes that are associated with the HPA axis. Megan Gunner undoubtedly talked about it. It's the stress system. That was a CRHR1 gene. The 5-HTT-LPR is associated with mood and emotion, and you saw that from the earlier even behavioral studies I presented. Okay, this one here is one about antisocial behavior. To give you a simple example, we looked at 3 genes: the tryptophan hydroxylase gene, the 5-HTT-LPR gene, and the MAOA gene. Now, why am I choosing these genes? they aren't just pulled out of the air. They're candidate genes that are chosen based on what we know from animal research and from human research. Not with maltreatment, but human research. So we then see what can maltreatment bring to the fore, and what can it help us with maltreatment. So tryptophan hydroxylase, TPH, has been shown to be major with aggression. 5-HTT-LPR, you know, that's mood, emotion, etc. And MAOA, again, is also aggression. And I don't know how many of you how many of you heard the name Caspi, Avshalom Caspi? None of you? In 2002, he was the first person studying maltreatment who looked at the MAOA gene and its high or low variant. It's a different kind of gene. You either have high activity or low activity MAOA. And he showed that if you had low activity MAOA, you were more likely, and you were maltreated, you were more likely to have higher aggression. That was published in the journal Science, which is perhaps the major journal in this field of science, and it just ushered in the whole field of G by E. So we looked at those three genes, and I can just tell you very quickly what we find. Again, if you want to look at main effects, if you're maltreated, you're going to have increased antisocial symptoms without any genes. Then you throw in the genes, and you can find more. You can find a G by E, but you're also finding the main effect of maltreatment. There is no main effect of genes. There's no main effect of genes in anything I've studied, or anyone in the literature has studied, period, the end. So, and that's one of the problems, is people keep looking for the gene for, and you see all these huge studies that never replicate, that never do anything, and it's because they have lousy measures of maltreatment, and they have lousy measures of behavior. And when you do a huge study to get, someone to fill out a number of measures so you have a good rating, let's say, of let's say depression, and to be able to get a really good prospective rating of maltreatment on thousands of people, that's real hard to do. And so they don't bother with that. They just look at the gene. I'm also fortunate in my work because I have several studies in the hopper that have thousands of subjects, which I've accumulated over the years. So, doing camp for 28 years and doing genetics in the camp ever since the human genome was discovered in 2002, and we went back to try to, because DNA doesn't change, so, DNA is DNA, so we could go back to kids we saw in 90, 91, 92, 93, try to get as much as possible. We have over 2,000, and some of those studies, again, they're not going to show that a gene, I don't know what they're going to show, but playing on what I've seen, it's going to be the G by E that matter. Now we're going to talk about, this is going to be looking at some brain stuff. And we're going to look at EEG, hemispheric activation asymmetry, and looking at its link to onset of maltreatment. Okay, now in asymmetry, the right side of the brain is so associated with negative affect, been found in all kind of research, with animals, with humans, with depressed people and so on. The left side, positive affect. So left side is approach, right side is withdrawal. And so what about maltreated kids when you're recording from EEG, when they're looking, when they have eyes closed and eyes open, just looking, straight ahead. Kids with kids who experience physical abuse have greater right activity. In other words, more negative asymmetry scores than non-maltreated kids. Maltreated children without physical abuse are in between. So they're in between mal, not PA, PA, non-mal, okay? Much more right hemispheric activation, negative affect, boom, in them. In the onset, did they experience onset early, onset and recent? Early onset, not recent. Later onset and recent, okay? Children with late onset of maltreatment beyond preschool have more right negative asymmetry scores, again, than non-maltreated kids, and maltreated kids with early onset, but not recent maltreatment. So in this one you can see where the later, more recent seems to be playing more of a role in this particular thing than early onset. So those are two things. Another one is Kids with this sort of gets a little bit at the chronic question. Children with more chronic maltreatment, that is kids who experienced at least 3 or more developmental periods in which they were maltreated, and we got it from records, they have more right activity than non-maltreated kids. So it even gets more so the more number of periods they experience. Okay, basically I'm going to now talk some about resilience. If you're interested in resilience, I just published a paper in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. And it's resilience and maltreatment. It's 20-some pages. It's everything that was known as of when I had the thing published, okay? Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry by Dante Cicchetti, the article. Now, basically, I'm rather going to talk than do this. Most of the studies in the field of resilience, Ann Maston, who's a leader, most of her studies, they're all psychosocial. They are not multi-level. So we know that there are psychosocial characteristics associated with resilience. In the maltreatment field until recently, they've all been psychosocial. But, and I think there's some reasons. One, when, say, Norman Garmsey, who was one of the fathers of resilience research, there weren't the same technologies available to study the brain, to study genetics, et cetera, et cetera. But now there are, and I think some people are afraid to study biological characteristics as well as psychological, because they might think, well, that harkens back to when we believed in invulnerable kids. If you have this biological thing, then you're fine. That's not true. Even if they have, this is all interactional and probabilistic. So you want to learn as much as you can about it to see what it might mean for treatment, if anything. And so I have done research where I have done multi-level studies of the development of resilient functioning in maltreated children. And we've looked at stress hormones such as cortisol and such as DHEA, and we have found that resilient kids have different patterns of cortisol across the day and across a week and then over time than kids who have other patterns. So for example, DHEA is usually pretty much stable across time. But kids who are abused and are doing well or maltreated and doing well, they increase, I don't know how they do it, but they're increasing DHEA across the day and over time. And they are in the resilient group. Physically abused kids who usually have low cortisol, and that's often associated with aggression and so on. Resilient physically abused kids have, cortisol that increases over the course of the day, just like the case with DHEA. So there are some of these findings that are coming out, and it's not saying that that's the only thing that causes it. It's one of the things, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's more than psychosocial variables, and we need to be looking at the other things. Now, I've also looked at genetics, and this is interesting. I chose 5 genes, and now we're doing, as I said, huge, big whole genome studies and all that sort of thing. But first we started out doing candidate genes, and we picked out some of these genes. The corticotropin-releasing hormone receptor gene, the 5-HTT-LPR gene, the dopamine receptor D4 gene, and the oxytocin receptor, OXTR. Oxytocin's associated with affiliation, often linked in there with attachment in some people's minds. Tom Insel, the director of NIMH, has done some work, a lot of it, with animals in the past. And then we also look at the glucocorticoid receptor gene. Okay? So we look at 5 different genes and how they link with resilient functioning in maltreated and non-maltreated kids. And interestingly, individually, the only gene among those 5 genes, which are pretty good candidate genes, because they're linked to things you would think of might do well, might be implicated in resilience. Like the only one was the glucocorticoid receptor gene. If you had a variant of that gene and you're maltreated, you're going to be doing resilient, you're functioning resiliently. The other genes, nothing, had no effect, didn't help promote resilience. In the non-maltreated kids, they did. In the non-maltreated kids, every one of those 5 genes played a role in, if you had a particular variant and you were non-maltreated, you're going to be a little better in your functioning, statistically significantly better than if you didn't, okay? And the thing that's very interesting to me is, once again, kind of almost like the finding with the suicide ideation, when I said those with 1 to 2 subtypes, any 2 look like they have more ideation, but 3 to 4, it's maltreatment overpowers it. I think that's the same thing that happens here, is that maltreatment just overpowered any of those genetic effects, which underscores, you know, how deleterious the experience of maltreatment is. So this stuff, by studying genetics, sometimes it can help argue for the case of experience all the more too. We also had what we called the psychoeducational parenting intervention, PPI. And that is an intervention somewhat like David Olds' home visitation. I don't want to say it is the same, because David has his own way of doing it and has nurses do things and so on, but it was sort of what we were modeling it after in our heads, without it being literal to what he does. And then we had a, what's it called? The community standard group. And these were maltreated kids who were getting treatment in the community, whatever that happened to be, and we would note that. And then we had a non-maltreated, matched on socioeconomic status comparison group. Okay, and we always like that, because if we can show that intervention is not only better than community standard, but it's as good as non-maltreated kids of the same social class, that's pretty powerful. So again, I can't get into all of the details about the intervention and so on, but what we found was at baseline, first of all, they're randomly assigned. So it wasn't like we picked the best ones and put them in the intervention. They're randomly assigned. And at baseline, that means before any intervention began, we did some evaluations of a number of things, one of which was the quality of the attachment relationship between that infant, who was 13 months at that time, and his or her caregiver. And I don't know if anyone mentioned this in May, but there's this experimental procedure called the strange situation, where there are comings and goings of mothers and strangers, and babies are in the room all the time, and you can classify quality of attachment. Avoidant attachment, secure attachment, resistant or ambivalent attachment, disorganized, disoriented type D attachment. When we looked at the baseline, again, and the coders are completely unaware of who's maltreated, of who's in treatment or in what treatment or any of that stuff. And you may find that, oh, come on, tell me you can't tell. Well, this is an honestly true story. I started research on this topic when I was at Harvard, and I would be behind the one-way mirror, often either filming or watching what was going on. And in Massachusetts, the state law was a 51A. That's what maltreatment was called. It's 221A in New York. It was 51A in Massachusetts when I was there. And I said a number of times, you know, by watching, God, if that's not a 51A, you can have my PhD. That's what I said with people, okay? You may be turned off by that, but, you know, sometimes, you know, it just seemed like there it is. So what was my hit rate of identifying accurate 51As? 50%, exactly. What happened was, as I was leaving Harvard to go to Rochester, someone had been chronicling what I was saying, and they came out and they showed me it's 50%. So I told this story at a maltreatment conference many years ago, and a guy named Ray Starr, who was an early maltreatment researcher, he said, we did it in an experimental way, and we got the same finding. So you can't tell is what I'm saying. At least not without, a lot of this stuff is you're very micro, you have to really pay attention to the tape over and over, etc. Baseline, the two intervention, the three maltreating groups, around 80 to 85% of them were disorganized, disoriented attachments, type D, and that's insecure, okay? And there were no differences among CPP, PPI, and CS, the three maltreatment groups. And then the non-maltreated had about a 50% security rate. And that's about what you see in the literature for kids from, low SES backgrounds. And, so middle-class kids are maybe 55 to 60. I don't know that it's any different, frankly. So we do the interventions. The two interventions we provided were weekly for the course of a year, theoretically. The CS we tracked for a year, community standard, and then we just, we looked at this. At age 26 months, like 12 months post-baseline, at the end of the intervention, the CPP group went from having 3% security of attachment at baseline to 61.4%. The PPI, the OLDS type group, went from about 2 or 3%, no differences in other words, to like 55%. And they were not significantly different, the two treatment groups. Both improved significantly from insecurity to security. The CS group started out as 4%, ended as 7% secure. And then 50 to about 48 in the non-maltreatment. Now we were a little bit surprised because the PPI, the OLDS type, is more of a didactic intervention, whereas the CPP is more, it's somewhat of a psychodynamic type intervention. And we thought, gee, you'd think that they would do better on attachment than OLDS, but as theorists talking and researchers, it's not we weren't unhappy that the kids were doing well. Well, we followed them another year, and what happened was the kids in the PPI intervention, the OLDS-like intervention, dropped in security down to maybe 20%, whereas those who got the CPP were up there at 60%. They didn't go, and it's like when you get into age 3, you're going beyond sensory motor development. Sensory motor development's like development in the first couple of years of life. It's probably, there's when you get into representation, like you do when you're in the toddler preschool era, when you have representation of your mother figure or your father figure or of yourself, that's the self issues I was talking about earlier. The CPP intervention seems to be more efficacious. So and then other things were outcomes. One of them was we looked at their HPA axis functioning, and the maltreated kids who were at baseline were all dysregulated compared to the non-maltreated kids. But over time, the OLDS intervention and and the other CPP intervention, they look just like normals. So the interventions helped regulate or normalize the neuroendocrine functioning. But I want to show you this stuff. This is, okay, is this it? Wait a minute. Okay, recidivism of maltreatment. 4 years after the completion of the study, CPP, PPI, CS, NC. NC is normal comparison. How many had maltreatment go back into DSS? How many? 4% of CPP 4 years later, 15% of PPI, 46% of CS, and 8% of NC. Then, let's look at foster kinship. 4 years post-intervention, CPP, 6% went into foster care, 12% of PPI, 29% of CS, and 5% of normal comparisons. So those are real-world indicators. Foster care, recidivism of maltreatment. So what I want to say in conclusion here is we're in the middle and the midst, actually, of a very exciting period because we're learning more about pathways to adaptation and maladaptation and resilience in maltreated kids. And the advances that occur in genetics, and then as your comment about epigenetics and brain imaging and stress neurobiology and immunology, all of which are interrelated and integrated, and there's a problem with one cascades across systems, leads to increased knowledge about the developmental processes that lead to psychopathology and resilience. And I think such enhanced understanding has great potential for the development and intervention, and implementation rather, of novel, perhaps even individualized, resilience-promoting interventions for maltreated kids and adults who are not functioning well due to their own historical experiences of adversity and trauma. And determining the multiple levels at which change can be engendered through these randomized controlled trials. So they're random. It's not picking low-hanging fruit and putting them in the intervention, for example. This will provide insight into the mechanisms of change, the extent to which neural plasticity may be promoted, and the interrelations that occur between biology and experience and psychology in the development of maladaptation, psychopathology, and resilience. So we can, conceptualize, I think, these efficacious resilience-promoting interventions, such as this one with attachment, as examples of what could be called experience-dependent neural plasticity. And we're also doing stuff which I don't want to get into, which is we're looking at the brain and imaging and in event-related potentials and EEGs and so on to actually see this stuff. Early intensive interventions in child maltreatment that could establish more nurturant and sensitive parenting, secure attachments, neurobiological reorganization, say of the HPA axis, as I said, for example, they hold great promise for instilling adaptive developmental trajectories in these kids. So consolidated, multi-systemic approaches that begin early in development are necessary, I think, to reduce environmental stress exposure and child maltreatment and allostatic overload. Remember we talked about allostatic load, allostatic overload to improve physical and mental health. And one of the things is maltreatment doesn't just affect mental health. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, go on and on and on. And maybe that's even going to be a link to helping more mental health money come in, I don't know, because sometimes people are uncomfortable spending money on mental health or whatever, and they think, oh, that's a real disorder, that's a physical disorder. Maybe if money can come for the physical stuff, it might also help the mental health, because they are interrelated. So I think that's where I'll stop.
Let's give you a round of applause.